Well, welcome in to the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, and today I'm really excited to have Jennifer Chiaverini. Did I say that right, Jennifer?
It's close enough.
Close enough. I'm so sorry.
No, no, no,
But
it's okay.
I'm so excited to have Jennifer on the show with us today. She's got a brand new book. It's called The Museum of Lost Quilts. And Jennifer, is this book 22 in this series?
That's correct. It's the 22nd novel in the Elm Creek Quilt series, and it's number 34 all overall.
Wow, what an amazing writing career that you've had. That's quite an accomplishment. This is book 22 in this series. Is this are we celebrating the 25th year of writing the series? Do I have that right?
It's the 25th anniversary of the publication of the first book in the series, The Quilter's Apprentice. But when I wrote The Quilter's Apprentice, I didn't realize that it was going to be the first book in a series. But even though I didn't plan it that way, I'm very happy that it worked out. And I'm going to celebrate the 25th anniversary as if I had it planned out perfectly from the beginning.
I love it. I love it. To get the conversation going, Jennifer, I love to start with a fun question to just kind of set the tone. And one question that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, it goes back to a very, very young age. I was an early reader, and I credit my mom for that because she made a point of reading to me and my brother and sister every day when we were young. And I really discovered my love of stories and storytelling and what it meant to share stories, just on a very personal level, being read aloud to. So that was something that really it's such an early memory. It feels like it's really always been with me, this hope to be able to share stories with other people and give them the joy that my favorite authors have given to me with their stories.
Love it. What was the uh, catalyst that made you write that first book? And was the first book that you published the first book that you wrote?
The first novel that I published was The Quilt Apprentice, and yes, it was the first novel I had completed. I've really always wanted to be a writer as long as I can remember. And when I was getting started back in the mid 90s, uh, the advice that I was given as a writer just starting out was write what you know. And since I was a quilter, and I still am a quilter, and I just loved everything about quilting, the art form itself, with
Mhm.
wonderful creative things you can do with the geometry and then also the free form patterns. And I love the evocative quilt block names that sometimes would celebrate a location or some aspect of nature or even a historical figure, all everything that those evoked, and the folklore that went around with quilting, and certainly certain quilt block names or patterns had certain myths and legends attached to them. But what I loved most and what was most important to me were the quilters themselves, the quilting community. It was just such a warm, welcoming, inviting place, a place where people freely shared their knowledge and their skills. They didn't hoard their secret sewing techniques to themselves so that their quilts would always be better than yours. No, no, no. That's just not how the quilting world works. I mean, if an experienced quilter is always welcome, always eager to share what they know with beginners. And I love the way that it would cross generations and people would come from all walks of life to become involved in this wonderful art form. And I really wanted to capture that into stories. So when I was told, write what you know enough times, I finally realized, well, I love the quilting world. That's what I should write about. But I always say that my books aren't about quilts or quilting itself, but it really is about quilters. It's about their community, their friendship. Sometimes there are little disputes. They don't always agree on everything, whether it's about technique or style or even colors they should or shouldn't use. And so but one of the things that I've heard from readers is that some of them are quilters and they love seeing their community represented with affection from an insider's point of view. But I've also heard from a great many people who have never quilted and really don't really ever want to start to try to make a quilt. They have other things they like to do, but they love it because of the friendships and the relationships and the way that the characters, they're certainly not perfect people, but they always
Sure.
strive to do better. They strive to learn and to work together in a collaborative way, and they stand up for one another when they're tough.
My maternal grandmother, who we referred to as Nana, was a quilter, and she had a couple of sisters, my great aunts, and they would get together and work on a quilt, and they uh, referred to these pieces very affectionately. And, when I was a little kid, I really couldn't appreciate it. But when they would start looking at a quilt and talking about all the pieces and all that, there was a certain look, that would come over their face. And you could tell that that they used it, to the best of my memory. They would sew in family artifacts, and they were tapestries of their family history, in a lot of ways. And they had quilts that their mother and their aunts had passed down to them. And there was this, it really was, a way for the family stories and the little pieces that might have gotten forgotten to kind of be encapsulated in something and to stand the test of time. What is it about the quilting community? Is it that sort of thing where this is a community of people that get to kind of hold on to memories in a very tangible way? What is it that keeps this art form alive and thriving?
Well, I think you're talking about a certain aspect of the quilting art
Sure.
where it's maybe steeped history and nostalgia. And there are many quilters who, like you, are fortunate to have those kind of family heirlooms that have been passed down. And it certainly is quite a wonderful family treasure when you can look at a scrap quilt and say, oh, yes, this was from the dress that I wore on my first day of school. And this is
Exactly.
from grandmother's wedding gown. And so that is one part of the appeal of quilting, is that it does evoke this idea of tradition and history and family and all of the wonderful things. But quilting isn't just part of the past. It is very much alive and thriving, and artists are innovating with quilting all of the time. So it's not just an art form of the past, and it's not just something of a bygone era. If you go to a quilt show or just a quilt shop or an art museum that displays quilt, certainly you may see some of those precious antiques or family heirlooms, but you'll also see contemporary quilters doing so many amazing things. You wouldn't have known fabric could be used in that way. But we have a wonderful quilt show here in my home state of Wisconsin called the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, aptly named. And it is just a dazzling exhibition of quilters really stretching the boundaries of what we may traditionally think of as simple patchwork and simple stitching. It's really breathtaking in the scope of the artistry and in the beauty of the designs. And sometimes, like artists in all kinds of art forms, the quilts are used to convey some kind of something from the individual maker. It is a wonderful form of creative and artistic expression. There are quilts to commemorate occasions or celebrate certain occasions, and also to capture a certain mood. And it's not always happy. It's not always cozy family hugs and that kind of thing,
Sure.
warmth that we usually associate with quilts. Like any art form, quilting has been used as a form of expressing concern or anguish or as a form of protest. So really, that certainly is part of it, and the nostalgia, the homemade scrap quilt. But I encourage everyone out there to really, if this appeals to you, to
Mhm.
really take a look at a contemporary quilt show that might be in your own town, or you could travel to Madison, Wisconsin, and come see the one we have here. And I think you will be amazed and impressed as you are having your definition of quilting expand beyond maybe what we associate with the bygone era.
Yeah. One thing that I love to talk to people about and to explore is how one art form can inform another. So, for instance, over the last decade of doing this podcast, I've met a number of people that were involved in film and television or in music, and I always love to kind of pick apart how those different artistic expressions kind of bleed over into writing and how one sort of one toolkit over here might come in handy as a writer for whatever reason. I don't believe I've ever gotten to talk with a quilt maker about how that intersects with the world of writing. Do you see overlap there, other than obviously talking about writing books about quilt making? But are there tools that you pick up from this artistic expression of making quilts that inform the writing process?
Well, I think they're very complementary art forms in some ways, and I think you could speak of it as, quilting. You bring together different elements such as fabric, color, pattern, texture, style, and all of that, and you have to find a combination that works for you to convey whatever it is you're trying to express. And the same is true in writing a novel. You have to bring together setting, character, plot, metaphor, and all of those different elements of a story, and put them together in a similar way. Um, and of course, there's overlap in my own writing, because in my Elm Creek Quilts series, I do write about the experience of quilters, and I do sometimes talk about the history of a particular style and things like that. But for me, the the way they complement themselves best occurs if I am maybe struggling with one, and by switching to the other, I can usually find a way to work through the problem whatever it is that I'm dealing with. So, for example, if I'm working on a novel and for some reason this scene just isn't going well, I can't make it work. Instead of sitting there at the computer and just trying to force it and trying to make it happen, I've learned that it's very beneficial for me to just take a deep breath and set it aside for a while. Ignore the pending deadline that is telling me, no, 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 stay at the computer until you get it done. Just ignore that little voice for a while. And then I go and I work on some quilting for a while, whether it's, even if it's a matter of, cutting fabric or pinning something together. And what I have found is that by doing something else creative and enjoying that kind of experience, in the back of my mind, my subconscious is working away on the problem, whatever it was that
Right.
had frustrated me before. And instead of forcing it to happen by shifting gears and doing something else that is creative, then it'll just, oh, that's what I should do. I should have Sylvia come into the room. Or, oh, wait a minute, in a previous book I introduced this character, maybe they should come back and we can find out what they're all about. And so whatever the situation is, usually by continuing to be creative but letting it flow rather than trying to force it, then I can usually go back and work through whatever problem was driving me crazy just a few minutes ago. So to me, they complement each other that way as well.
I love it. You said that when you first wrote your first novel, The Quilt Maker's Apprentice, that you didn't plan for this to be the first in a series. This was just a book that you wrote. When did you realize that people really resonated with that book and resonated with the world you had created? And when did you start thinking in terms of series potential?
Well, I wrote The Quilter's Apprentice, and I thought that, I'd write that, taking the advice, writing what I know.
Right.
I wrote this one book, and I was very fortunate that it was warmly received. And I thought, oh, well, I guess I could. The first book focused on a young woman who was new to town and wanted to learn how to quilt, and Sylvia, her older mentor, who teaches her how to quilt in exchange for doing chores around her house, and the friendship that they forge and the stories and confidences they share while they're having their quilting lessons. But I had also introduced other characters, other local quilters, a local quilting guild. And I thought, well, I think my readers, they seem to have taken to these background characters or these secondary characters. I should write a book that allows me to develop them more fully so we can really see what they're all about. So I wrote Round Robin, a sequel. And so I thought, okay, I wrote a novel and its sequel, and then I'll go about other things. But at that point, when Round Robin came out, readers began to tell me on book tour and via email that they really wanted to go to the quilt camp and they wanted me to build it. But I'm a writer. I can't run a quilt camp. So that was not going to happen. So since I couldn't send these eager would-be quilt campers to quilt camp in my novels, I thought, well, the best thing I can do is send them there through the eyes of some characters. So I wrote The Cross Country Quilters, which was not focusing on the people running the quilt camp, but was instead introducing 5 new characters who came from all across the country, and they attended a week at quilt camp where they became really good friends. And then it follows them as they go their separate ways until they reunite the next year at camp again. And it was when I was about part of the way, maybe a third of the way through writing that novel, my third, that I realized, well, I guess I'm writing a series. And so at that point, I began planning it out a little more consistently. But since I didn't start out writing a series, I didn't have a long-term plan that, okay, it's going to be this number of books, and each one is going to focus on this particular period of time or theme. So I haven't really followed the traditional series format. Sometimes I do just go in straight chronological order, and one book will pick up a little bit after the previous one left off. But other times I will take a secondary character and give them their whole novel, sometimes in that same central Pennsylvania location, but sometimes elsewhere. Or I will delve into the past and I'll focus on Sylvia's ancestors, and I'll write about the antebellum period or the early 20th century or the World War II era, all centered around the same location, the Elm Creek Valley, but exploring different characters, different eras, different historical events that are all still tied in some way to the world of Elm Creek quilts. And because I was able to do that, because I didn't have it all planned from the beginning, it's given me a lot more artistic freedom to take risks and do something different and not be locked into something that would be, just more formulaic, I guess, for lack of a better euphemism. So since
Right.
that's not what I've been writing, it's kept the series fresh and interesting and enjoyable for me to write. And I think that definitely translates into a much better reading experience for my audience. So that's what I'm doing with the Quilt series. But sometimes with my standalone historical fiction, there has been a story that I've been compelled to tell that just doesn't have any connection to this world of Elm Creek quilts,
Sure.
in those cases, I write a standalone historical novel. And, that has allowed me to tell other stories that I've been inspired to tell, um, apart without trying to shoehorn it into a series where it doesn't really fit.
Yeah. Speaking of those standalone historical novels, you have written a number of novels that take place earlier in the 20th century. I think all of them take place in the 20th century. I'm trying to. No,
No,
maybe not. Anyway,
I
yeah,
have some that take place in the 19th century as well.
yes, yes. And in your Elm Creek series, you've got some books that are dual timeline,
Mhm.
that kind of alternate between present day and a previous time. But even in your new book, The Museum of Lost Quilts, it it takes place about 20 years in the past. 2004, I think, is the setting.
Mhm.
What is it that fascinates you about writing about the past, even if it's recent past? But what is it about this series and your historicals? What is it about finding those little nuggets in our past that are so fun to bring out?
Well, I didn't consciously, deliberately set the Museum of Lost Quilts in the past. Yeah, it takes place in 2004, but that is where I left the series off with my previous characters. So we have our own timeline. We're existing in our timeline, and it proceeds at a certain pace. And in our existing timeline, it takes me about 2 years to write a book. The time I really start getting serious about it, because sometimes the idea percolates in my brain for a few years, but once I
Sure.
really get down to starting the pre-writing, the planning, until the time it ends up on your bookstore or library shelves, that's about 2 years. So for me, a book takes 2 years. 2 years is in the writing process. But for my Elm Creek Quilters, well, that novel might only cover the length of a summer, or it might cover, or even just cover one weekend of a frenzied quilting, joyful quilting marathon.
Right.
So, so my less time elapses for my characters than elapses for us in our reality. So this is the Museum of Lost Quilts is not intended as a historical novel. It's just that that is where the characters are. That's where they're living. However, I did have to, look up certain things. If I would, think, oh, well, maybe I can have Summer Google this. Well, I had to make sure, did Google exist then? And the answer was no. The internet did, and there were websites. Did Facebook exist? Yes, but it was just at Harvard for students at Harvard. It was called the Facebook. So I did have to do some historical research, even for what for me I consider a contemporary book.
Sure.
So if you're looking for straight up historical fiction, I'd recommend one of my standalones rather than or even the historical novels in the Elm Creek Quilt series. But to answer your question, have always been fascinated by history, especially women's roles in history, because too many women have always contributed. We weren't just passive bystanders for millennia, not doing anything.
Right.
But their stories have been largely omitted from the larger historical narrative. You might find them in the margins or in the footnotes of someone else's story. Sometimes it's because the person writing the story just didn't think women's lives were important enough to mention. And other times it was because it was more deliberate. A woman had made a discovery or some important contribution, but a man deliberately wanted to omit her from the narrative and claim credit for her achievements. That has happened. It's happening today. It happens all the time. It happened throughout the 20th century and before. So I have wanted to bring out the stories of these women who made important contributions, but were largely overlooked. And although they might have been well known in their time, they didn't make it into as the central focus of the historical narrative. Um, and I think, well, if I'm fascinated by this woman and what I've learned about her, I bet other people would be too, if only they knew that she existed, if only they knew what she had done. So I like to draw out from the footnotes, from the anonymous area where they were left, and bring them out and to the best that I can show what their contributions were and who they were as women and who they were as people, so that if their story has been largely forgotten, it won't be entirely forgotten. And maybe now their achievements will help them get some of the recognition they definitely deserve.
Over the last few years, there's been a resurgence or maybe a surge of interest in mid 20th century history, especially around World War II. Lots and lots of books published, fictional historical novels, which is always kind of a fun thing to think about. We're talking about sometimes real people, definitely real world events, but a fictional narrative weaving in between these real concrete events that happened. Um, and I've often wondered why we as a society get interested in particular time periods or particular historical events. And I was thinking about this one day, and I think the vast majority of people, their their knowledge of history is reduced to what they learn in a history class in school a lot of times. And the farther we get away from a historical event, the more those events get reduced to just bullet points. This happened on this day, and these are the people that are pertinent to the situation, and you lose all of the context of why this thing happened or who the heroes were and what the heroic events were. And you lose. So if you just reduce it to bullet points, you lose the whole story of it. And a lot of times you lose the meaning of what happened and the lessons that can be brought from that. So when we're dealing with historical fiction and you tackling a topic that is an actual event, sometimes with actual people, but writing a fictional narrative, because a lot of times the details, the particulars have been lost to time. How do you balance those two of being true to the story while having the freedom to paint a character with a nuance and with details that come from your imagination? How do you balance those two?
Well, one thing that readers should always keep in mind is if it says novel on the cover, the author is allowed to make up as much as they wish. You can
Sure.
make Abraham Lincoln a vampire slayer if you
Yeah,
wish.
and
So if
and
you
they
are
have.
looking for, and they have, if
Yeah.
you are looking for something with which to write your history dissertation, then you should probably look to primary sources. Um, the acknowledgments pages of some of these novels can be great places for that, but if and every author has their own place where they draw the line. How much do they want to have incorporating, strict adherence to the historical record, what we have of it, and what is purely products of their imagination. And that line is in a different place for every author, and it can be wherever the author wants to put it. If they want to invent completely fictional battles for the Civil War, they're allowed to do it. And you need to, maybe if you're evaluating their writing, you can just focus on, well, how well do I think they did that? So I don't, I think, and in discussions with my readers and in authors' notes, I've made it clear to I hope it's clear. I have told my readers that the way I approach it is that I do like to follow the historical record as far as major world events, major world figures, and things like that. And you talked about writing about the heroes. And I do think it is important to write about the heroes. But one of the things I'm especially drawn to are the lives of ordinary people in
Sure.
these extraordinary circumstances. Because, yes, the heroes that we learn about in history class, they lived and they did things. But I also want to know, like, well, what was it like for a woman who was a seamstress? What was it
Right.
like for a college student? What would, like, in my book Resistance Women, I have a young woman who was in Berlin, and she was a college student at the time. Now, she was a fictional character, but I drew upon narratives that I had read about, historical narratives that I had read about other college students, young Jewish women who were in Berlin at the time, to create my fictional character. So I don't feel like there has to be this rigid, hard and fast line of what is allowed and what isn't. If you're saying you're writing a history book, if you say you're writing a biography, then yes, you need to adhere to the historical facts as best as you can determine them from the historical record. And I say that because the historical record has gaps. The historical record has
Right.
errors. It does. But when you're writing fiction, you have the freedom to do whatever you like. And readers, for their part, have the right to decide what amount of author's pure imagination they are willing to accept and how much they want it to be strictly historical. I think most readers of historical fiction, people who enjoy reading historical fiction, realize that there's a broad range and different authors are going to take different approaches, and it's all acceptable. And what we need to do as readers is to, and well, is this a story that feels like I'm being immersed in this world? Even if this particular character didn't really exist, do they feel real to me? Do they feel like someone that could have existed? And am I getting insight into this person's experiences? And by extension, the experiences of other real people who did live through that historical event, by exploring this through the fictional perspective of this invented character. So I don't like to have, hard and fast rules about what is accepted in historical fiction and what isn't. If it says a novel somewhere on the cover, or anywhere else in the metadata, then anything goes, really.
Gotcha. You talked earlier. You mentioned pre-writing and the beginning of a writing project. I have heard you say in some other talks that you have given about the job of the writer uh, being in charge of the novel writing process, and I'm going to butcher this, but you were responding to someone, I believe, who might have mentioned about how the characters have a tendency to do what they want to, and you kind of pushed back against that notion and said, no, I'm the writer. I'm in charge of this. The characters don't just willy nilly run around on the page and I chase them down to figure out what's going on. I'm in charge of this project. I'm the boss of this. Um, one, and I have a tendency to ask 15-part questions, so I apologize. But one, what is your pre-writing process when you begin a novel? What do you set out to do that helps you then get started with the drafting? And how do you feel about the idea that characters do what they want to do versus the writer being in charge of her project?
Well, it really depends on the book. I don't know that I've really started a book thinking, okay, this is what I want to do with this, except in the case of a historical novel where I've thought, wow, this person's life is so amazing, or oh, this group of women, they were so fascinating. I want to share their story with other people. It's um, really just that. And I think with my most recent book, The Museum of Lost Quilts, I really wanted to give readers of the series, people who've enjoyed it for so long, just a chance to get back into that world where where they feel like it's their own community. It's a fictional community, true, but they feel like they've been reading about some of these characters for 25 years. Some
Right.
people have just they've come to it very recently and they've read all of the books in a shorter period of time. But for people who've enjoyed this series, I wanted to give them a chance to return to that book and to again be in this world that they think of as a second home, and to be among these fictional characters that they think of as friends. So my pre-writing, my preparation for writing a book differs depending upon whether it's a contemporary Elm Creek Quilts novel or if it's a historical novel. If it's a historical novel, then I start by doing a lot of background reading about the era that I'm focused on, or the location. I shouldn't say or, it would involve the location as well. And
Sure.
if it's a particular historical event, doing a lot of research into that. And that helps me discover like what historical figures I might want to draw into the story, what historical events I want to make sure that I include. And I make a timeline to help me keep those kind of events in order. And from there, then I can see kind of where the narrative kind of naturally flows, where it kind of naturally builds and ebbs and things like that. When I'm writing an Elm Creek Quilts novel, unless it's a historical novel in the series, then part of what I do, I will, I'll investigate quilts of that particular period, because I want to authentically represent what quilters that period would have been working with. I might, in fact, I very often go back to some of my previous books to see, just to verify, okay, now what was their relationship like? Where was she living? Did she ever express some goals or concerns that I haven't addressed in a book? So historical fiction means a lot of going back into primary sources, whereas writing the Elm Creek Quilts novels often means going back to my own books just to see, where the threads of the story were and where I need to take them up and continue on.
The Elm Creek Quilt series, 25 years, 22 books. This community that you write about has expanded, and some characters have come and gone. And like any community, it's a living, breathing entity of its own. Um, are there more stories to tell from Elm Creek, or is this a bookend on that series?
Well, I do have another book coming out in 2025, which continues some of the storylines that I introduced in the Museum of Lost Quilts. So there will certainly be one more next year. And as I've said all along, if there's a story that it really depends on what I do after that, because that book is already in the works, it's in production process. What I do after that, it's just going to depend upon what story I'm inspired to tell. If I want to write something about the Elm Creek Quilters, then I'll do that. If there's a historical event that I find compelling and that I think readers would too, then I will do that. So it's really going to depend upon what story most inspires me and what I feel most excited about writing when the time comes to begin a new manuscript. So I'm not saying, I'm keeping my options open for
Sure.
both genres that I enjoy writing in. And I've been very fortunate that my readers, some of them prefer one form over the other, but most of them like whatever it is I'll be coming out with next, because they notice that there are common elements to both genres. I like to focus on the lives of women. I like to touch on themes of friendship and on confronting obstacles with moral courage and doing what is right even when it's hard. And my readers will find that those sort of topics, those sort of themes, in both the Elm Creek Quilt series and in my standalone historical fiction.
The new book, The Museum of Lost Quilts, an Elm Creek Quilts novel, the 22nd in the series, is out everywhere now. You can grab it in Kindle edition, or if you want to hold the paper in your hand, you can grab a hard copy. And is this also available as an audiobook, Jennifer?
Yes, it is.
Have you gotten feedback from readers that might have discovered the series and have been reading the audiobooks? I wonder how that experience has been for new readers who are primarily audio listeners.
Well, I haven't heard uh, directly from someone who has identified them as a new audiobook listener, but I do know that the audiobooks have been very popular, and the readers, both of my historical fiction and of the Elm Creek Quilts novels, have just received rave reviews. I've heard so many good things from my readers, from the listeners, who really like the way that the readers have recorded the stories and have given life to those books. And I've heard from a lot of quilters in particular who enjoy listening to the audiobooks because they like to listen to the stories of the Elm Creek Quilters while they are quilting. So I like the thought that my characters are keeping all of these quilters company as they're creating new quilts, new objects of beauty and warmth that will comfort people, or maybe it'll be a new artwork for the wall of their home. I really like the thought that my quilting readers who like audiobooks, really any readers who like audiobooks, are enjoying stories much the same way I first enjoyed them when I was being allowed to by my mom as a very young child.
I love it. We're going to put links in the show notes where you can click over and grab your copy of the Museum of Lost Quilts and Elm Creek Quilts novel number 22. Or if you've got a local bookstore that carries new releases, go visit your local books, support local books. Um, Jennifer, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into this amazing series, or maybe they're interested in your historical fiction, or just want to see what you're up to these days, is there a central location that is a good place for people to find you online?
Sure, they can just go to my website, jenniferchiaverini.com. And I won't spell it for you, but it's on the book cover. And yeah, there I have all kinds of information about my books. There are pictures of the quilt that appear in novels. There are, because I know it's I personally love to see those visuals when I'm thinking of a quilt or reading about a quilt. And there's also links to my pattern books, because I've written pattern books so that if you want to reproduce one of the quilts you read about, you can do it as well. And then I have a blog there, a list of my events and all kinds of things. And you can learn more about the books if you're interested in diving into one of the historicals. My books cover, all the way from the early 19th century into the mid 20th century for my historical fiction. So if one particular era suits you more than another, well, I might have you covered, but you can find out by visiting my website and taking a look.
Fantastic. And we will link up that website in the show notes to make it easy for folks to find you as well. Jennifer, this has been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Sure. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.